Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all so much for coming and for giving us a few extra minutes. My name is Joe Davich. I'm the director of the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, DeKalb County Public Library, and Conversations at First Baptist Church, welcome to our conversation this evening. So just a couple notes, so we all have it in our heads for the evening. Don't forget, Charis does have signed copies back there. Elaine, after the program, if you would like the book personalized, that's a name, not a verse, a name. She will be more than happy to do that after we will have the table pulled out here. We will form an orderly line right here in front of the stairs. I don't need to tell you where you are, so we're all going to form an orderly line at the very end. I would also like to thank the Decatur Book Festival. We are back. We are busy planning. Leslie and Denise are working very, very hard to put on a beautiful event this fall. You know, I don't know how many of you have been to our events over here at the church. We have been doing events over here for about 16 years at this point. It started with the book festival years and years ago. Charlene Harris was here when her books were very, very popular, and the show True Blood was on HBO. So I was the sacrificial lamb to call the Baptist Church and to try and convince them to be a venue for the book festival, because unlike the line tonight, Charlene's went out to the street and down to the MARTA sign for her. She was exceedingly popular, so I called then Reverend Julie Pennington Russell, who was here, and left a message that was something like, "Hi, my name is Joe from the Georgia Center for the Book for the Decatur Book Festival. I was raised a Catholic, I'm sorry. But would just like to know what the Baptist view on vampirism is, and if you would like to be a venue for the book festival." Apparently, Julie kept that message for quite a few years. So we are so pleased to be back. Deborah and her staff here and David do such a wonderful job of welcoming everyone in to the community here of book lovers that we have. So when we start the program, restrooms will be down the stairs to the lower level. So we're trying to just keep traffic down up here. Thank you for that. Please sit back and enjoy. We are so very pleased to bring you our program tonight. We have two wonderful speakers who I personally admire so much, and in a venue that I personally admire so much. So will you please join me to welcome Reverend David Jordan.
Thank you, Joe. I got the feeling you were going to go ahead and introduce Elaine and Barbara, and so I know you all are a little disappointed to see me, and I'm going to make this very quick. I'm so glad you're here, and I have the great honor of representing our church and welcoming you. And I also want to speak for people like me who have been impacted by people like them. I first got exposed to and introduced to Elaine Pagels with Beyond Belief in 2007. If you've read this book, you know it begins with a very confessional, extremely vulnerable story of Elaine struggling with deep grief at a horrible illness that her infant child was undergoing. And she found herself going to church, needing church, being in a congregation, and sharing raw and extremely vulnerable truths about her need to be around other people who also were being honest about the struggle and how hard life can be and how beautiful life can be and how important gathering together in a congregational setting is. And then I read Barbara Brown Taylor's book, Leaving Church. and I found with both of these world-famous theologians the gift of vulnerable honesty and the recognition that we're all in this together and that life can be really hard and life can be and is truly sacred. So from these two amazing theologians, we're so thankful to be a part of this experience tonight where they can share from their heart and be the very open and people of great integrity and intellect and honesty that all of us appreciate. So it is my great honor to welcome to our platform tonight Elaine Pagels and Barbara Brown Taylor.
I have come through the apocalypse of burning cars and fire engines and a sky full of black smoke to join you and be here tonight. I'm so happy I made it. This is such a wonderful book that we've come to discuss tonight. That's an intended pun. And like a lot of other people who are here tonight, actually you dawned on my horizon with the Gnostic Gospels in 1979. I've read everything you've written since then with special love for Adam, Eve, and the Serpent, 1988. The Origin of Satan, 1995. Beyond Belief in 2003. And Why Religion in 2018. Now, I don't want to make much of our ages here, but that's 39 years worth of books. And here we are with a new one, which I would love to have made required reading for the classes I taught at Piedmont College if it had been in print. So my first question to you is, why this book now?
Well, thank you. And I'm very glad to meet you, because I so much appreciate what you do, and I'm very happy to be here at this church. This book came as I'm thinking about finishing teaching. And for a long time, I feel like I've been institutionalized for 40 years, at Princeton. And I couldn't think of a better place to do that. But I've been teaching sort of how Christianity began. I mean, that's what I set out to find out when I started. Like, what is this about? How did people do it? And why does anybody care, Amazing. So this one, I was asking, because I'm really not a theologian. That's kind of I'm happy that our Pastor David says that, but I'm a historian, so I ask questions like, what do we know historically about Jesus of Nazareth? I mean, was there such a person, or was he a fictional person? That's the obvious first question for many people. And what do we not know about Jesus of Nazareth? And that's, I'd say, 95%, because the earliest story, as you know, is 15 pages long in the Gospel of Mark, and the others are just sort of adding to it, Matthew and Luke, and then John's doing something else. Well, that's another story, yes. But also, I'd written about the secret Gospels, and I got so excited about them when we suddenly had them explode what we were thinking about, change the whole picture of early Christianity by opening up so much more that we never knew was there, and things that I actually love. So this book, I wanted to look at the Gospels of the New Testament and at the secret Gospels, and then at the politics and military history and social history, like what's going on in Judea at the time Jesus is born, at the time Jesus is living there, and at his death, because all of that has a huge impact on his life and his death. So those questions have been asked by a lot of people. What do we know historically and what don't we know? But the other question is really the so what question. It's like, why do I still love teaching this stuff? Why do these stories, why do I find myself intrigued and charmed and puzzled by them all the time? There's much more than is there on the surface, you know. And then there's 2,000 years of people interpreting them, which gives you a whole legacy of different ways of reflecting. So
and you
that's
have a
what
whole
this
chapter
is.
on that, tracking that around the world. After 2,000 years, what are people doing with the stories? But I'll get to that later.
Yes, absolutely.
I know what people do with books they love, and I know how they mangle the titles. So I'd like to point out this is Miracles and Wonder, which many of you will turn into Miracles and Wonders, but that's not what she said. And I think you just told us, and I'm going to ask again, the role that wonder plays in this book, because my great joy in reading it was how often you would put potentially upsetting material out there and then say things like, but who knows for sure what's possible and not possible? Not to get off the hook. That came from a deep place of faith in uncertainty and in unknowing. True?
Yes, I think people often expect that you'd give the answer, but so often there isn't one. There's not a single answer in many cases, and often we just don't know. So I wanted to be quite aware of that as we proceed, because that's one reason. There's so many ways to interpret some of the things that we read in the Gospels that it allows for, for people from Pentecostals to Russian Orthodox and Christian Scientists and Baptists and Presbyterians and everybody else to put different perspectives into them, as people have for thousands of years.
Yes.
So, a range of traditions, really.
Every time we talk about Christianity, I want to make it plural. Because what we have in the most populous religion on the face of the earth is a gigantic umbrella with many, many Christianities underneath it, in my view.
Yes, and I totally love the book by William James, the psychologist, calls The Varieties of Religious Experience. And he talks about very different ways people engage, whatever you're going to call it, the sacred, in very different kinds of response and perceptions and language and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so, that's what those Christianities do. Mm-hmm. That isn't to say they're all equally valuable, because some of them may really go against the spirit of these teachings as you understand it and as you've written about that.
Yeah.
And we all know that. There are clashes, but there are very many different ways of approaching it.
Absolutely. I tried to figure out what they all had in common once, and I came down to Jesus was a very interesting being. That's about it. So, what I would like to do with you is go very lightly through some wonderful passages in here, and of course there'll be the ones that struck a note in me. And one is when you are dealing with birth stories, the whole first chapter around virgin birth and birth stories. And I'm wondering if you are willing to deconstruct the traditional Christmas pageant so dear to many of our hearts. And tell us what is wrong with having magi and shepherds on the stage at the same time.
Well, I've gotten into trouble for this, as you know.
I didn't.
Well, I was teaching a class with a colleague at Princeton called Jesus and Buddha, and he's a specialist in 11th century Buddhism. And the way we did it was we compared the lives of the founders. We started with the birth and background and, sort of a biographical approach. So I started this that way, even though the earliest story we have in the Gospels doesn't have a birth story. That's Mark. He doesn't say anything about that. I mean, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus appears as a young man going out to see John the Baptist, accepting baptism, and having a vision, right? And John's Gospel doesn't have a birth story. It just says, where does he come from? He comes from God. That's John's statement, and Mark would say the same, I think. Mm-hmm. But Matthew and Luke put in a birth story, each one writing later, and apparently after people hostile to the movement had suggested that Jesus' birth was irregular or illegitimate, simply. That people were saying that in the first century, hostile to the movement. And so each one wanted to create a story that would show that Jesus deserved to be the King of the Jews. I mean, after all, Jesus is said in Mark to be a rural carpenter. How do you get from that to being the King of Israel, which is what Mark claims as well? So Matthew starts out with a genealogy that takes Jesus all the way back to, King David and King Solomon. And Luke starts out with a genealogy that takes him all the way back to Adam. Problem is the genealogies are different. And some people say, well, one is for Mary and one is for Joseph. But it doesn't work that way, because it was always patrilinear. It was always coming through the father. Abraham gave birth to Isaac and so forth, and Isaac gave birth like that. So the stories are so different once you think about it, right? But if you've been at a Christmas pageant, and probably a lot of people here, you see shepherds and a stable and a child in a creche on straw, perhaps. And you see three kings arriving, and you see angels singing, and what else? Animals, sheep, and so forth.
Gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
Yes. So the very wealthy are arriving to praise Jesus, and the shepherds in the field, and everyone's there together, and it's just wonderful. But that's not how the stories are told. And the people whoever wrote Matthew and whoever wrote Luke wrote them independently, so they didn't know what the other person was saying. So Matthew's story starts out, if you just read it by itself, it's about the genealogy of Jesus, and it says that there's a woman named Mary, and she's engaged to a man named Joseph, and he's shocked to find that she's pregnant, and then an angel appears and explains to him that this is going to be a divinely chosen child. And the story here is the story of an infant king, an emperor of the world, a royal baby to whom these royal gifts are given, right? And King Herod gets very angry and tries to destroy the child, and the three ambassadors from foreign countries come to give homage to this newborn prince. And then his father has to take him into Egypt to escape the wrath of King Herod and so forth. So that's Matthew's story. It's a story about of a royal birth. And Luke's story is so different. Luke's story is about a rural couple. They don't have much money, and they certainly don't have any prestige, because they can't find any place to stay in Bethlehem, and they have to stay in a barn. And nobody is there but the shepherds, and angels appear. It's a lovely scene. But it's totally different. The pageants that we do in churches just mix them all up in the same soup. So you have three kings, and you have shepherds, and you have animals, and you have the baby in a manger. But that's not the way the story's told.
No, my theory is just to get more children in on the act, and that's just, you need more characters.
Yes.
But I've sometimes said, to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and try to harmonize them is like throwing Zora Neale Hurston and Eudora Welty and Flannery O'Connor in a blender and just seeing what you come up with, for the story of Southern writers. It's such disrespect for the writers, in my mind. So yes, that's exactly what I hoped you would say. So it's fun, but it's misleading. And when I was trying to teach undergraduates about these separate voices and different stories, that couldn't stand up at all to whether they were a shepherd, an angel, or a cow. In their memory. That was the story that got in first. It's just interesting.
That is right.
Yeah. A lot of us, how many people here speak Koine Greek, which is the language of the New Testament? Come on, put it up there. I want to see it high. I'm counting one. I see one, I see one, I see one. Stopping with one. So that's the language. Oh, two. Anybody else? I can't see too well. Point is, not a lot of us. And in seminary, I chose Hebrew, not Greek, which means I can't read the New Testament in the original language. And what I'm doing instead is reading through so many translations as I go to see what the variations are, because they're quite surprising and quite different in some places. You know, in some places, a woman is called a deacon, and in other places, she's called like a slave. And it's the same word, diakonos. I do know how to look words up.
Yes.
So
read Greek.
I wondered what you would say about what we should keep in mind when we're reading in translation. And if we can get any help with that, perhaps a study Bible. But it just seems to me when we forget that we're reading in translation, we're missing stuff. And every act of translation is an act of interpretation. And so I don't want to get overly suspicious about that, but I want all the help I can get for those of us who cannot speak or read Koine Greek.
Yes, it makes a huge difference. Yeah. I mean, the idea of virgin birth seems to come from Isaiah, the prophecy in chapter 7, which says in Greek, the Lord will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you will call his name Emmanuel, God with us. But in Hebrew, which is the language in which Isaiah wrote, he certainly didn't know Greek, it just says a young woman. So Matthew is reading in Greek and writing in Greek. Although he's Jewish, many educated Jews could speak very well in Greek and used it literarily. And Luke was a Gentile for whom it was a common language. So that idea comes in from a translation, among other things.
For any of you who teach Bible study, one of the most fun things to do is get some parallel Bibles with about 6 translations and have one person read one of them out loud and get the others to go, when they note a difference between what's in theirs and what's in that one. Those, I don't have to say a thing after that's happened. They get into their own discussions about the differences that they find. So I actually love that that's true in a way. Later we'll talk about the multivalence of the stories and how that may actually be a benefit and a source of life instead of a problem. So the kind of historical depth that you present, I think it can be, as I said, upsetting to people who've never encountered it before. Freshman in college who takes her first Bible class and finds out there are 4 different writers in the book of Genesis and 2 stories of creation, just puts her head down and cries for the rest of the class. But it can also be revelatory to others. And there is one story in particular that you add historical facts to that opened the story up for me as recently as last week. And it's the story about how Jesus went to a man in chains in a graveyard with shackles that could not hold him because of the strength of the demon that had taken hold of him. And when Jesus appeared, the man ran over to him and bowed down. And the demon's voice said, "What do you mean to do to us?" And what happens is they beg to be cast into 2,000 pigs who then run down into the sea and drown. That's an odd story.
It certainly is.
But you help me make some sense of it.
2,000 pigs stampeding down a cliff.
And what are pigs doing in Israel?
And yeah. And why did Jesus? I mean, it's the only story when Jesus does exorcisms of demons. These demons say, just let us go into those pigs, and he gives them permission. Now, that's kind of unusual. So what did you find there?
Okay, let me just put this out here. Boers and a legion who was in that area, a Roman legion who was in that area at that time, so that when Jesus says, "What's your name?" and they say, "We are legion," you had things to say about Roman occupation and about flags bearing a boar on them.
Yes, this really took me by surprise, but when you realize that the Judea in which Jesus lived was dominated by Romans, and there was a great deal of animosity between the population being exploited and overtaxed and often robbed and often violently treated and abused by the Roman soldiers who were constantly in Judea. In fact, we know there was thousands of Roman soldiers stationed very near Galilee, where Jesus was born, about 3 miles away. And they were stationed there because the town had participated in a revolt against Rome, and the Romans came in with massive troops, burned the entire city to the ground, and enslaved all the inhabitants. That's what Romans did, right? And so there was one Roman legion that was particularly, as Jewish historians have said, it was the face of Roman brutality for Jews. And that was the 10th Legion that was started by Augustus. He sent it into pacify Judea, which meant, he crucified 2,000 men suspected of revolution about the time Jesus was born, and thousands after that, and Jesus of Nazareth too, of course. But that legion was also the one that occupied Judea after the Jewish war, about the time Mark was writing. And it was a very brutal place. And today, if you go to Israel, you can still see the ruins of the Roman camp that they built to house the Roman legion there. So I realized, I said, this demon-possessed man says, our name is Legion, for there are many of us. And then I looked at a picture of the 10th Legion, and the motto on their, the standard, the banner that they wore, the mascot of the 10th Legion was the wild pig. And I thought, oh, this story has a secret code. And to know the code, you have to know the Hebrew Bible. That's right. Because Romans would never get what the story was about at all. It was just a crazy story. But Jews who knew the story would recognize that it has resonates with the story of Moses. Now, how, right? Do you want to go into that?
A test. Okay, so not only, is there a legion and a pig, but there's also an evocation of the sea being parted, and
well, it's about, it occurs, all the miracles that Mark describes from the 4th chapter to the 8th follow the Passover story. And for those of you who know the Passover ritual, it starts, as Moses is given power over the sea so that people of Israel can go through the sea on dry land and escape from Egypt. And the second thing that happens is that they're escaping through the sea, and the Egyptians' armies follow them, but the waters come crashing down on them, and they all drown in the sea. And after that, the people of Israel are wandering in the wilderness, and they are hungry because they have nothing out there, and God feeds them with manna. Yeah. So chapter 4 to chapter 8 of Mark replay that entire story in the life of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And suggest, I think, this is meant to suggest to the reader, because Mark isn't writing scripture, as you know. He's talking about the scripture. That's the Hebrew Bible. Yeah. He doesn't know we're going to call it scripture. Yeah. So he's saying what Jesus is doing is acting out the same thing that Moses did. First, he's in a boat, and he and his disciples are nearly drowning, and suddenly he says, stop, and the sea stops, and the wind stops, and they're all safe. That's echoing the Moses story. And then the next thing is that these foreign beasts, filthy pigs, as they would be seen by devout Jews, and their banners, and the filthy Romans, as they saw them as well, would be destroyed like the armies of Pharaoh. And then after that, just as Israel was out in the desert, mm-hmm. he speaks about how Jesus is out in the desert trying to get some quiet time with his disciples, but crowds follow him and they have nothing to eat, and you know what happens, right? He begins to multiply the loaves and the fishes and feeds 4,000 men And then Mark has him do it all over again in chapter 8. I think it's 5,000 men. And then after that, the Pharisees come up to say to him, well, if you're the Messiah, show us a sign. And he says, what do you mean, show us a sign? I'm not giving you a sign. And then he goes out in a boat with his disciples, and he says, you have to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, because, it spoils the holy bread. And they said, we forgot
the sandwiches.
We forgot the bread.
We forgot the sandwiches, yeah. This is the great literal versus metaphorical.
Oh, yes. You mean the story that a little boy had a lunch and everybody brought out their lunch and shared?
Oh, no, when he said the leaven of the Pharisees, and they thought he was about to scold them because they hadn't brought sandwiches in the boat. And he said, that's not what I'm talking about.
Yes. He said, didn't you see what happened there? There was enough bread to feed thousands of people. Anyway, it was a sign. And there are many mysteries that are hidden in the stories. But you would know them if you were a devout Jew hearing the stories of Jesus, because he knew those scriptures deeply.
So first of all, she's telling the story with excitement. She is not acting like a scholar. Sorry. I just love the way these stories are alive in you.
Well, yeah, but you can't love this stuff if
I know. I just noticed it. Okay.
And that's what I was thinking. These stories are very powerful.
Yeah, very.
They have multiple depths that sometimes we don't get if we just read them on the surface.
Two hardest historical facts for students in my New Testament classes were, one, that the Christian canon was not settled for good until the end of the 4th century, almost 400 years. And the second thing was that the 4 Gospels that were in existence at that time were just a few of a great many. I think Bart Ehrman takes them up to about 23 Gospels that were known, or fragments of them, which are many of the things you found in the Nag Hammadi library, which I'll ask you if we have time, but since you've done that in other books, I'm going to stick with this book. I sometimes felt like an assassin of their faith for bringing these facts and a lot others to their attention, and I want you to tell me I did the right thing.
Well, you did the right thing. Because actually, the canon means it's a standard. I have one that I got in Egypt. It's a piece of heavy brass on a rope. And it's a standard. It's like when you're building a wall, how do you know it's straight? You may have a level, but they would hold up this rope and make sure that it was straight. So a canon is a standard. And it was supposed to be a standard for what you read in church, for everybody. This is for everyone who comes. But the other Gospels, many of them, were not meant to be publicly read and announced in church at all. Because the New Testament Gospels talk about what Jesus preached on the hills of Galilee to thousands of people. That's what Mark says. And then he says, and when they were alone, he was alone with his disciples, he said, to you, only you, I'm giving the mystery of the kingdom of God. The people out there, I'm just telling them parables. I'm not going to tell them the secret. Right. And Mark never tells you what the secret might have been. So the other Gospels claim to be, many of them, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, claim to be secret teaching. So it's not that they're supposed to replace the other Gospels. It's just that they take you to an advanced level. Mm-hmm. But people who aren't ready for that probably would find them puzzling and not make much sense out of them. So that's why we know 4 Gospels. Yeah. And the others remain to be secret. And then we're called, of course, Gnostic. Heresy.
Though you did preach a sermon at the National Cathedral on one of them, the Gospel of Truth, and I'm looking that up to see if I can listen to that sermon, because that is one of the Gospels. If we had time, we'd read you some of these texts, and many of you've already read them, but they're amazing texts, and especially to ears who have been captured by 4 Gospels alone, and I'm really glad we got 4, because a guy in the 1st century suggested we just have a whittled down edition of Luke and 10 of Paul's letters and just call it done, with no Judaism in it at all. We're past that. And he was finally, declared a heretic and a blasphemer. He did not make it.
Well, many groups were using only one, as you said.
Yeah.
Some would read Matthew, and others Luke, and others would read John. And I think the person who first suggested those four thought that only four together give you a fuller picture.
Yeah.
And they do.
It's true, and it gives us endless things to talk about. So, I don't want to miss. Where's Joe? Joe, how long are we supposed to talk and yield? Joe, work? Okay, I now see where you are. You start giving me this when it's time. Okay, I want to get a really important question. What I've done now is just gently touch the chapter on Jesus' birth. I've touched a chapter on the miracles that he did. And then there is a chapter on crucifixion. And I, for reasons of my own personal and academic, worry a lot about the parts of the New Testament that blame Jews for Jesus' death. Most chillingly, the verse in Matthew's gospel that has Pilate turning Jesus over to his own people and saying, and then the people say, "His blood be on us and on our children." And if I had to count how many Jewish lives that verse may have cost through the years, I don't ever want to know the total. So I was helped a great deal when you called me and any of us who read these texts to remember that we're reading wartime literature. So anything you can say that help those of us who are reading the Bible we love, and it's our sacred scripture, and it's blaming Jews over and over again while Rome gets off free.
I know, and it couldn't have happened that way historically. There's not any historian who knows about Roman judicial procedure.
Yeah.
That is, recently I told someone that the Bible was counterfactual here, and that is what it said isn't true, and he was pretty shocked. But what he had said is, but the Jews killed Jesus, you know. I mean, Pilate said he was innocent, and Pilate was going to let him off, and the Jews kept shouting, and that's why he was crucified. And I said, that is what the Bible says, but it couldn't have happened that way.
Right.
Because there's only one man in Judea who was authorized to order the death penalty. I mean, the soldiers could do it in cases of insurrection, and as I said, thousands of Jews were killed, thousands over the span of Jesus' life. He was just one of so many. But it couldn't have happened if Pilate, the governor, had not ordered the death penalty. But I started to look very carefully at the stories about what happened to Jesus after he was arrested. It seems clear that he set up public demonstrations that really upset the chief priests who were in charge of keeping the peace. And they were doing it under the iron fist of Rome. And if they hadn't kept the peace in Jerusalem, the Romans would have come in with force and started killing people. That's what they did.
Better that one should die than all
Yes.
of those. Yeah.
And John's gospel tells that what happened with the death of Jesus is that the Jewish council was really worried about thousands of pilgrims coming in at Passover, and people got especially intensely resentful of Roman domination because only God should rule Israel. And Jesus then went into Jerusalem acting like a king, and people are hailing him as a king in public. And the Romans standing around Jerusalem in force would have noticed that very clearly. And the next day he goes into the temple and starts another demonstration. And the temple people come to him and say, who authorized you? He says, I'm not telling you. I'm quoting Mark. And so they send out the temple police. They have 5,000 temple police because they are supposed to keep the feast. And it's hard to do with a population that so much resents a foreign domination. So they sent out to arrest Jesus and took him to Pilate and told him that he was a danger for revolution. And Pilate said, get rid of him. But the stories never say that. They absolutely refused to say that Pilate gave the order, which had to have happened. And they instead blame it on the Jews. And I thought, why? What is going on? And I realized that right before Mark wrote, the most prominent leaders of Jesus' followers had been brutally killed, right? And you know who they are. Paul was beheaded by a Roman magistrate for leading a group. He was whipped and beheaded. Peter was crucified and mocked in a cruel way, horrible death, also by order of the Romans, because only Romans could crucify people. And James, Jesus' brother, was lynched and stoned to death in Jerusalem. That all happened around the years 62 to 68, right before a full-scale war broke out. And so after the war, when they're writing about, we are followers of Jesus, they knew that if someone said, you're a follower of Jesus, and you'd say, no, I'm not. They actually tried to arrest his relatives because they thought he would be plotting along with them. But if you denied it, they would still believe that you're one of those people. You should probably be crucified too. And so to save their lives and the lives of other followers of Jesus, they had to find a different way of telling the story, which was harmless in a way, because there was no persecution of Jews in the Roman Empire at that time. It didn't harm anybody until you had a Christian empire, a totally unexpected thing in the 4th century. And then being a Jew became rather dangerous when you had Christian emperors.
That's right. I still remember visiting an assisted living place with a lot of Jewish residents who vanished during Easter season. And when I asked one of them what was up, they said, it's not good for us to mix with Christians when Easter's coming up.
Where was that?
Just a nursing home in Atlanta that I used to visit. It was a real from the people, and in many cases it was memories inherited from grandparents who had come out of the Holocaust or who had been there in 1938. And at any rate, these passages became lethal.
Yes, I heard the same thing in New York when I spoke about this. I didn't know that. They said that Christians would come out of church hunting down Jews, and Jews would hide because they could be beaten or they could be attacked or spat upon or vilified in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
And even now, any freshman who comes into my class will say, the Jews killed Jesus, whether they're Jewish or Christian. And I think it was told that way to save lives, but the unexpected consequences have been horrendous, and I think we need to understand that.
Wow.
Now.
Wow. I was entranced with your description of the round dance of the cross on pages 151, 153, which are found. She'll tell you where it was found. And I couldn't stop thinking about how Christian worship would be so much more interesting if we danced our communion with Jesus instead of kneeling to eat his body and drink his blood. Those are not mutually exclusive, but I would love for you to talk a little about the round dance of the cross.
Yeah. Well, one of the texts that I found totally charming is probably 2nd century, and it was found in ancient monasteries, in many monasteries. The secret texts that I work on were also found in a monastery library. And it, in the Gospel of John, there's no Last Supper scene, right? Because John wants to say that Jesus becomes the sacrifice for Passover, so he changes the date. So anyway, there's no Last Supper scene. So somebody filled it in and said, well, after Jesus spoke to us that night, he led us out into the hills above Jerusalem, unto the Mount of Olives, and he said, let's dance. Answer amen to me. And this is an ancient Near Eastern dance, often danced by men in a circle. So they would hold each other's hands and dance in a circle one way and the other way. And somebody who was being Jesus, taking his lines, stood in the center and said, I am the way for those who walk upon me. I am the light for those who see me. I am whatever. He speaks this way. And there's a woman in the dance who dances, and somebody is playing the flute, and it's a beautiful dance. And my favorite line in it is, whoever does not dance does not know what happens. And it's a ritual. It's a Eucharistic ritual. They have bread and wine, but they're celebrating in a very different way.
I will be saved and I will save. Amen. I will be loosed and I will loose. Amen. I will eat and I will be eaten. Amen.
And those are the words of the person speaking Jesus, and all the others come in with the music and the call.
Well, if you ever wondered about that hymn that's got Lord of the Dance in it, stay curious. Okay. I do think now, Joe, that we're almost to 8 o'clock, so I'm leaving so many things on the paper. But I think that you have written a book that restores wonder as an indispensable spiritual gift that must never be sacrificed in the name of certainty about what we should believe and why. So I wonder here at the end what you still wonder about. Or wonder about the most now that this book has been released into the world like a dove.
Well, I was very struck this time around. I know other reasons why I've loved these stories, many reasons. And I used to think it was primarily the teaching of Jesus, which it is in many ways. But this time around, I realized that the stories in the Bible have a pattern that I'd never noticed. Yeah. It starts with, say, Moses, okay? The people are oppressed and enslaved and bitterly grieving the bad treatment they have with a foreign domination. And the Lord sends someone to take them out of that oppression and free them. And they come into their own land and they become a great people, right? That's the story. And then you have Daniel in the lion's den, and he comes out alive, and the lions don't hurt him. And Jonah's in the whale, and the whale spits him out, and there he is. And the most excruciating story of all is the story of Jesus, who's horribly crucified and tortured and dies, and then returns, comes back alive. And I realized that for us who live in a world which we know about people who suffer illness, who are very worried about death, who are living under war and oppression and destruction and fear, these stories basically say, yes, I know that world, but in any case, no matter how desperately awful it looks, there's hope. They move into hope. They move into a key. It's like from a minor key into a major key in music. And we love that. Mm-hmm. So that when we have a story like, Easter and the death of Jesus, it nevertheless becomes a time of rejoicing.
Annual. That is what I also hear in what you're saying that I love, which is not only when things are at their worst is there hope, but then it'll go back to worst, and then there'll be hope, and then there'll be another kind of worst, and there's still hope. So it's a cyclical trust or kind of faith in change, in possibility over time, around and around. So it's not only about it's awful here, but it's going to be great there.
That's right, but it's also, like all of the Jewish stories, like the Kaddish that people sing when they're grieving, it's praise of the Lord.
Yes.
And something else can open up at that time.
Yeah.
So I think that's an extraordinary power of these stories altogether.
So I want to make one pitch for a group I'm going to form called the Godly Agnostics. Because I think that word just means I don't know. I don't know for sure. I don't know. I wonder, because I don't know for sure. And I thought that, now I think this. And I just don't think it's a bad word. I think it's a pretty great word. So I'm going to invite you to join. And just remember me, Barbara Taylor, Atlanta, Georgia, early in the book tour. So that's all the time we have. But I'll tell you what, all the conversations I didn't get to engage with Professor Pagels are in this book. It is, for me, a builder of faith and a support to the recognition that the stories happened in a real world. There wasn't all that different from my real world, so that the history and the faith stories don't fight, they enhance. They bump around on each other, but they come out like that. So you'll have to read the book to find out about how Jesus became God. That took a while too. And especially who he is, present tense, not was, to new converts by the thousands, especially in the Southern Hemisphere, and to artists and filmmakers engaging him today. So those are things we didn't get anywhere near, but they're right there. Would you like to say anything at the end that I did not ask you?
Yes, I would have loved to. I was thinking when I said, why do we care about these stories? I mean, people are still converting to Christianity all over the world, in many places. And I was very curious about, I wish I could write 2,000 years of why people do that in many different ways, but I can't do it. So I chose some contemporary examples of people who are becoming new Christians in Madagascar and the Philippines and India and Latin America and so forth, and why certain wonderful filmmakers are using gospel stories to speak their own truths, because these stories really are powerful and they speak to all of us in different ways.
Mm-hmm. And Jesus comes alive in so many different ways in the stories that you tell. So I believe that this part of the evening has ended, and I need Joe badly to tell me what the next part of the evening is. There he is right there.
Yes,
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this conversation.
So, class, we are going to take a few questions. The microphone is here. Before we do that, just a reminder, as Barbara Kings-Oliver told us so very insightfully on this very rostrum, how do you know it's a question? Well, your voice should go up at the end, and that way you know it's a question and not a declarative statement. I know it. Also, I know there were several of you people who want to ask questions. Only Helen Thomas in the White House press corps gets to do a follow-up, okay? Question. So let's start with about 4 or 5 folks. Do 4 or 5 folks have questions? Okay. Lady in the peach. Did I see someone in a blue shirt and glasses? Gentleman in the green. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Anyone over here? Anyone in the cheap seats? Anyone in the cheap seats? Okay, perfect. Oh, lady in the pink. Excellent.
Thank you for talking about those very problematic scriptures about the Jews and the blaming. I am married to a Jew, and this is a very difficult time every year for her. And I wonder what you would say about how we read those scriptures that come up in our worship services every year at this time that are anti-Semitic.
Yes, I mean, I wrote that book. I was actually surprised. I hadn't realized how deeply that was embedded in the Passion story that I loved when I hear it with Bach, you know, the St. Matthew Passion, the St. John Passion. It's all there, and it's kind of subliminal. I hadn't noticed it, and I was ashamed of that. But I realize it's very powerful, that message, and it's not true. I'm quite convinced of that and I'm not alone in that regard at all. But still, most people who hear about Christianity, whether they're Jewish or Christian or neither, have heard that. So I do speak about that in my class. And I think that's why I wrote this book. As I said, it wasn't done out of malice originally. It was done out of self-protection. But we have to recognize that this is not a story that should continue that way. I mean, even the Catholic Church after 1,000 years, 2,000 years, agreed with that.
And it's a great time of the year for Christians to remember all the time that has passed since these texts were written. I know some churches who invite rabbis in to speak on Good Friday. I know other churches who have rewritten the prayers, have rewritten, even in my tradition where it's just all by the book, have rewritten them because of the harm done by them. Because I, for ages, just told people in the churches I serve, don't come on Good Friday. If you love somebody who's Jew, do not bring them. Do not bring them.
Well, I have to always remind my students that Jesus was not a Christian.
Oh, yes, he was.
No, he wasn't.
That was one of my questions for you. Who was the first Christian?
Well,
no, I had
no,
students.
but I mean, the movement really started after that. He spoke out of his tradition, and he interpreted and transformed it. But I think if you asked him, he would say he's like other rabbis of his time. He was interpreting, and I think that's what he was doing. Whether he's meant to start a new movement, that happened after his death, quite a long time. I'm not saying it shouldn't have happened, but he saw himself deeply in that tradition, as far as I can read it.
Which got lost. I mean, we don't have time for a whole Bible class, but by the end of the first century, Greeks were much more interested in the Jesus story, thanks to the evangelistic movement that moved out from Jerusalem. And so things like a man born of a woman by God, and, there were many things about the Jesus story that were far more palatable than people who say the Shema, every Sabbath, the Lord our God is one, who say, I can't count one on two fingers, and you're worshiping this other person. So there is much in the story that we need to talk about, and it's hard to talk about it on your holiest weekend, right? Ways we got it wrong.
Thank you. Thank you.
I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, and I am curious, do you address the my God, why hast thou forsaken me in your book?
Did I?
Yes.
Yes, of course. I mean, that's deeply part of Mark's understanding of the crucifixion.
I think it's
and it's also, I have to talk about how various historians have interpreted that prayer. As you know, it comes from Psalm 22. Right. And then Luke actually drops it when he writes his gospel, even though he knows what Mark wrote, and put a different psalm. Lord, into your hands I commend my spirit. That's Psalm 31:5. So it was a problem, I think, for some people to suggest that Jesus felt abandoned. But it's also a very poignant story. I don't know, what would you say about it?
Exactly what you said.
But he is basically quoting Psalms.
Oh, yes.
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 And that was very enlightening to me when I learned that. So I just wanted to make sure that you, in fact, had included that, because I think a lot of people will find that very nice not to know that he felt abandoned, necessarily.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a very interesting article I read by a scholar. It's called Jesus Prayed the Psalms. And there are many parts in the New Testament where Jesus speaks in the words of the psalm, and his followers understood that as the son of David, as they understood him to be. They thought the psalms spoke that Jesus was anticipated in the Psalms of David. And so they saw these as prophecies of him.
Thank you for another brilliant book. if the historical Jesus, in your opinion, awoke from a 2,000-year-old nap, say, today, what would he think about what's said about him in the creeds and in high Christology and equating him with God?
He'd say, is there a synagogue around here? I'm only half teasing. First time I took students to a synagogue, I felt Jesus sitting by me like I hadn't felt him sit by me in a long time. And he could do everything in the prayer book.
You said you could?
The first time I took students to a synagogue, I felt Jesus sitting right here by me, and I couldn't read the prayer book, but he just kept saying everything in Hebrew because he knew them all. I'm halfway. He's asking you, what do you think if Jesus showed up? I didn't mean to take the mic, I just picked it up.
I mean, in Matthew, Jesus says, when they say good master, he says, why do you call me good? The only person that's good is God. Don't speak that way. And so it seemed to me that he never presented himself as a divine being in that way. That's just,
But
there's a lot we don't know.
What would he think about it? I mean, I agree he didn't, but what would he think about us saying that about him?
Well, I
will
wish
say,
I could ask him.
she does work on the two creeds in here, differences between the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, where they came from, how they're very different,
Right.
which churches they're used by and why. So you will find some of that in this book. And you'll also find treatments of, the last words, which we just heard. So,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Hi. I grew up atheist, and I am very new to all of it. I'm not saying I'm joining or anything. I'm just very curious, and I wonder about the myth of the Jewish myth, and I try to think about why they were so picked on. And I'm wondering if it's because they wouldn't worship the leader of the country or something like that. Because I know the myth had to come from hatred of all the Jewish people, right? So, somebody had to start it, and it was probably by the religious leaders or the country leaders, correct? So that's what I was wondering. Do you have a theory on that, or is that something you studied at all?
A theory for why Jesus was treated so badly by Jews according to the New Testament, or another?
A theory on why the Jewish were picked on, but also why do we know that Jesus was Jewish?
What was the question? Why we say that Jesus was Jewish?
Right. Did he, you didn't grow up in a Jewish family at that time, did you? Or wasn't religion wasn't it fairly new at that?
He was taken to the temple at his birth and presented to the Lord according to Jewish ritual. He was buried according to Jewish ritual. You ask a lot of people, he lived and died a Jew.
And he spoke in synagogues and very often quoted. I'm not sure whether he could read or not, because we don't know, although Luke has him reading Isaiah. Maybe he couldn't read. A lot of people couldn't. But he would have known by heart many passages from the scriptures. So I don't see any reason to question that at all.
Yeah, and that he was one of more than one rabbi at the time who were wrestling with Torah, and there were Sadducees who only honored first 5 scrolls of Torah. There were Pharisees who grabbed onto many more. There were quarrels between different factions arguing about how you should be Jewish under Roman rule. And some of the stories I love best is there's a house of Shammai and a house of Hillel, 2 rabbis of the time. They're arguing about whether if an ox falls in a ditch on a Sabbath, can you pull him out? And Jesus just got into that fray. He was not the only argumentative person of the time, though he caught attention for these demonstrations you talked about on holy days. That's my theory.
And furthermore, if you read it in Greek, he's called rabbi. It's translated teacher in English, but where it says teacher, the word is rabbi. So, it seems he's very much at home in that context.
Yeah, and even in the Gospel of John, when Mary sees him in the garden but doesn't know who he is, doesn't she call him Rabboni?
She got Rabboni means my rabbi. Yeah.
My rabbi. My rabbi. That's at his resurrection.
And what do you think, if I'm going to ask one more question, since there were others, what do you think made him the one that everybody wanted to follow so much? Was it what he said or how he said it?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear.
Why was he the one who got in trouble?
Yeah.
Why
Is that fair?
Why did he get in trouble? Because he set up demonstrations that the Romans took as a threat to their power. They thought he's just another one of those Jews who's trying to start a revolution, and that's going to destroy our people. And the war that started after his death was horrible for the Jewish people. It was devastating.
Yeah, Galilee was known as a place for tax revolts, and that was his hometown up there. So, yeah, I think I would, that's the way I see it too. He ran afoul, and he ran afoul with some of his parabolic sayings that people heard literally, as you're looking at God right here, but I don't think that's the way he said anything. So, enough for now? Or we could have a class. I'd love it.
Thank you for this conversation. I have a question, Professor Pagels, about something you said about, I think, the idea of readiness, that there was
a little louder, because
I'll start again. So when you were talking about the Gospels that we know, and then also these additional Gospels, you mentioned something about the idea of readiness, the readiness to go beyond parables, to maybe think about some other aspects that Jesus was trying to teach. Can you say a little bit more about what that means to you, and also how that relates or not to this idea of wonder that is so central to the book that you have written? Is that clear?
can you help me? Because I sort of missed some of.
Did you want me to say it again?
Sorry.
We're getting an echo here is
Yeah.
one thing. So if you can hold it just like this, it will give you a great deal of projection.
How's this? I feel like I'm shouting. Okay. All right.
Shouting is good.
Here I go. I heard you make a distinction between the four Gospels that we know and these additional Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, Thomas, Truth, Mary Magdalene. And I thought that you said something about either that Jesus believed, or Jesus was saying there's a readiness question about whether people could engage in those additional teachings. And so I'm curious about how you interpret that idea of readiness, and then additionally, if you have time, to connect that to the idea of wonder that is central to the book that you have written.
Well, thank you. The first thing is that Mark says in Mark 4:10 and 11 that he's only telling these certain disciples. He said I'm speaking to those, to you alone. And Paul, when he talks about his secret teaching in 1 Corinthians 2, he says, well, I'm not going to tell you people the deep things of God, because you're just babies in Christ. You don't understand anything yet. So I'm giving you just milk to drink, you like a baby. I'm not going to give you the deeper truths, which he called the meat. He said, only to those who are mature. And the word in Greek is teleoi. It means sort of spiritually mature. So he felt that there was a threshold. And you know, every religious teacher, a priest, a rabbi, a Buddhist, imam, they will say one thing to a public audience of many people and something else to their closest students who are going to ask deeper questions in many ways. So it's that sense that these people are ready to understand something more deeply. Some of these secret texts sound to me a great deal like Jewish mystical thinking, and it was against all tradition to write that down, because if you say to somebody, if you teach some mystical teaching to people who are immature, they can become megalomaniac. You know, they can think they're God. They can think they know everything. So they have to be mature enough to receive what is taught. And so that's just the way people give mystical teaching. To this day, I mean, rabbis don't talk about mystical teaching much in public.
Yeah, there even used to be a rule you couldn't read the book of, was it Ezekiel, until you were 40 years old?
Yeah, well, that's right. Or the Song of Solomon, for that matter. That's true.
Thank you all so very much for coming and engaging in our conversations tonight. I will have Professor Pagels down at the table to personalize some of those books that are already signed from Charis Books and More. Pick them up as you leave this evening. Once again, a big round of applause. Elaine Pagels, Barbara Brown Taylor.
And now you get to sign more books.